All right, good evening, 8th grade. Today we are doing the notes for Radical Reconstruction, which is Chapter 13, Section 2 in your Social Studies books. We last left off talking about President Andrew Johnson and Reconstruction. We talked a little bit about the Freedmen's Bureau and Southern labor, as well as the Black Codes and the 13th and 14th Amendment. So we are going to be talking about radical Reconstruction. The vocabulary you should have for this section are the Reconstruction Acts, carpetbaggers, scalawags, impeach, the Ku Klux Klan, the 15th Amendment, and the Compromise of 1877. Okay, so radical Republicans, and radical means extreme, wanted the federal government to completely remake Southern politics and Southern society. Basically, these radical Republicans, and a Republican was Abraham Lincoln's political party, but these were the radical Republicans. They wanted the president to forget the pardons, forget the nicey-nice. The South should pay for what they did. So a majority of Congress in the late 1860s thought that President Andrew Johnson was way too soft on the Southerners, and they thought that basically President Johnson was doing a really bad job of Reconstruction and being president in general. But in March 1867, so just a couple of years after the official end of the Civil War, Congress passed the first two Reconstruction Acts. Johnson was not in favor of these acts. He vetoed the bill for the Reconstruction Acts, but Congress ended up overriding his veto. He was not a very popular guy, so Congress easily overrode his veto. If you want to understand a little bit more about what overriding a veto means, or a veto in general, you can see on YouTube, I'm Just a Bill by Schoolhouse Rock, to review how bills are passed and those types of things. But the Reconstruction Acts were basically meant to undermine President Johnson's authority and undermine his presidency and undermine all of his plans. The Reconstruction Acts, in order to help rebuild the South in a way these radical Republicans saw appropriate, was that the 10 southern states were divided into 5 military districts. And if you want to see a picture of that, you can look on page 331 in your textbook. And that's page 331 again. Georgia ended up in the 3rd district with Florida and Alabama, and that was led by Major General John Pope, and the headquarters of the 3rd district was in Atlanta. The Reconstruction Acts, aside from dividing the 10 southern states into the 5 districts, said that the southern states had to approve the 14th Amendment and write new state constitutions in order to be readmitted into the Union. So Georgia decided to register African Americans to vote about drafting a new constitution, as well as a lot of whites would be voting as well. However, since this was the first time many African Americans were allowed to vote, many whites refused to do so. So a Georgia Constitution convention opened up in Atlanta in December of 1867. The motion to create a new Georgia Constitution had passed. A lot of African Americans actually participated in this vote. A lot of the Democrats in the South who were not in favor of this new state constitution idea were refusing to vote on meaning of principle, so the resolution passed. They would write a new state constitution. So in December of 1867, a constitution opened in Atlanta to talk about this new document. But at the Constitutional Convention of Georgia in 1867, there were a lot of people complaining about carpetbaggers and scalawags. A carpetbagger was a northerner who moved to the South after the war to work in Reconstruction governments. So it was basically northerners trying to get a job in the South, babysitting Reconstruction in the South. A scalawag, on the other hand, was a white Southerner who cooperated with the Republican Party and African Americans. So it was still frowned upon to be supportive of the federal government during this Reconstruction in the South. And those Democrats in the South were really, really against anyone from the South supporting the federal government. And then they definitely didn't support people that were hired by the government to come down to oversee Reconstruction. So Georgia's new constitution had several provisions. First of which, it allowed voting rights for all adult males, the prohibition of slavery. Again, that's just basically approving the 13th Amendment in the Georgia State Constitution. The Georgia Constitution had support of free public education. The Constitution also got rid of whipping as a punishment. But the state capital was moved to Atlanta, effective in 1868. So the capital in 1868 moved from Milledgeville to Atlanta. And then the Constitution also enacted a poll tax. And this meant people had to basically pay this tax to be able to vote. So think about who this poll tax was hindering from voting, who may not have had a lot of money to be able to pay this tax to be able to vote. Either way, a man named Rufus Bullock was elected as governor over a Democrat. And the Democrat that he was running against was a former Confederate General, John Gordon. But Rufus Bullock had won. During his time as governor, 29 African Americans were elected to the Georgia House, and 3 were elected to the U.S. Senate. But African Americans being involved in the legislature would not last. As long as the Democrats had a say, once Democrats would come to more power, the African Americans would not be allowed to serve in state government or national government for that matter. But to really discourage and hinder African Americans from voting and exercising their rights, the Ku Klux Klan was founded in 1866 by Confederate war veterans in Tennessee, and other groups formed throughout the South, including in Atlanta. Basically, the Ku Klux Klan used terror and violence to keep freedmen from voting and exercising those rights that they had so desperately wanted for all those years. There was an incident in Camilla, Georgia, known as the Camilla Massacre. There were 12 African Americans that were killed in 1868 during an African American protest. This is just one example of how the Ku Klux Klan instilled fear in people. If 12 people got killed in Camilla, then that could happen in my town. Maybe we just shouldn't vote at all. Was kind of the mentality for many African Americans in the South. But moving back to federal government, on February 26, 1869, Congress passed the 15th Amendment, which guaranteed all male citizens the right to vote regardless of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Georgia would have to ratify this amendment to become readmitted into the Union. This readmitting into the Union had a lot of stipulations and was rather a lengthy process. But Congress officially readmitted Georgia to the Union on July 15, 1870. But Democrats did get control of the House and the Senate, which make up Congress. So Democrats basically controlled Congress. Many of those former Confederates were Democrats. Governor Rufus Bullock, who had been a Republican, which maybe was a little bit uncommon for Georgia, but again, African Americans were allowed to vote at the time of his election. They would have supported a Republican. He was accused of corruption by many of these Democrats, and he resigned and left the state. A Democrat was voted in his place in a special election. So not only did Democrats have control of the House and Senate, Democrats had control of the governor's seat in Georgia as well. A group of redeemers, which were basically white Democrats who brought their party, the Democratic Party, back to power, moved really quickly to basically undo all of the Reconstruction acts that the Republicans had enacted. They wanted to limit African American rights. So they cut property tax, they cut money for public education. And again, the idea of African Americans voting was not something Democrats were in favor of as well. But the final blow to Reconstruction came with the presidential election of 1876. It was a very close race for the presidency between a Republican, Rutherford B. Hayes, and a Democrat named Samuel Tilden. Since the race was so close, a commission was called to basically settle the discrepancies between electoral votes. There was some recounting going on, that's not fair kind of thing going on. So a special commission was called to basically settle this issue. But at the end of the commission, it was determined that Rutherford B. Hayes won by one electoral vote. That's unheard of. Most people that win the presidency win by multiple electoral votes. But in the Compromise of 1877, the Democrats said, yes, we'll accept Republican Rutherford B. Hayes' victory as President of the United States if all of the troops that the federal government has down here in the South to supervise Reconstruction, they all have to leave. So we'll accept Rutherford B. Hayes' presidency if all of the troops from the federal government get out of here. And so an agreement was made and federally supervised Reconstruction ended. And so this was the end of Reconstruction. There was a lot of work in the South that needed to be done, but because the Republicans really wanted their guy in office, troops pulled out of the South probably sooner than they should have. There was still a lot of poverty, damage, and things like that in the South. So that is the section on radical Reconstruction. And if you want to go back and preview some pictures and diagrams and charts and things like that, you're looking at page 330 to 335. For homework tonight, you are going to be doing number 5 on page 335, and you need a minimum of 6 dates on that timeline, a minimum of 6. Again, you have a quiz coming up, and actually, not a quiz, a test coming up, and your test is going to be on Friday. If you're just blowing through this homework assignment, that is not helping you prepare for this test in any way. The way you are going to be prepared is if you are taking just a few minutes to do the homework correctly, and you're doing it so you understand. But again, your test is going to be Friday. You will get a study guide very shortly. And make sure you are prepared. Go back all the way into chapters 11, 12, and 13. So have a good evening.